Well, thank you very much. Good. I guess it should be about 12 o'clock your time. So just good afternoon, or it's just about lunchtime, I suppose. Andrew Morton here, Vice President, Sales for DefensX. Great to be here. Pleasure. Wish I could be there in person today. Looking forward to coming there for the next one of these in person. With me is owner Yodimchi. Owner is based out of our office in Europe. I'm based in Canada at the moment, but our company, well, as everybody probably knows or remembers, we're actually a New York-based company, DefensX. We're looking very much forward to getting started. So let's get right into it. I think I have about 30 minutes, if I understand correctly. From what I understand from the format, it's a little bit difficult remote. We can do some Q&A at the end of this. I think Sharon will probably handle a lot of that. So we'll get right into it. Lots of new stuff to talk about. Talk a bit about DefensX. I know that there's probably a number of people here that also know us already. There are some new features, and I'm very excited to share these with everyone. And we'll give you a little bit of an overview. We'll talk about how we transform any browser into a secure digital workspace, business impact, and we'll go from there. So, very, very quickly before we get started, I think it's really important to talk a bit about to what DefensX really is, which is really to redefine ourselves in a lot of ways. We do redefine the browser, and that's any browser as the digital workspace. Very much so, the browser in general has become the operating system for the business. And what that means is that with applications having moved online, the browser now has become the prime communication vehicle between most workers and their everyday applications. And with that, and essentially what we're doing is we've really built a platform that covers a number of areas. And we'll talk about these in our session today. But we're taking any device, running any browser, and we're doing everything from protecting SaaS applications to doing browser isolation, which we'll talk about. And I think everybody probably knows what that is. But we're also at a very base level preventing phishing attacks, data theft, data loss, and a little operative thing called AI. We're also doing data protections against AI, and AI brings all kinds of data challenges, which we'll talk about, both from AI-driven attacks to AI actually putting company data and private data at risk of the entire world accidentally getting their hands on it. So we'll talk a bit about that. But because we're now locking down that surface, and what DefensX really does is really turn that into a secure surface. Well, why wouldn't we take it a little further and make that a real enterprise class type deployment? So and because we're able to do things like browser isolation, why not get into things like zero trust? And we now have the opportunity to do things like replace VPNs and thin clients and do it in a very secure manner. Because we're already doing this, why not truly lock it down and make it secure? And because the browser, and because we're able to see traffic and see usage and see where people like to click things and all of that, well, it gives us the opportunity to collect all that data and build a little resiliency and compliance, because now we're able to see the browsing habits of users and workers. And that's something we've always had, which is our dashboard. But we've taken that a big step further, and we're able to do things like now turn around and use the browser, turn around and communicate back to users and say, hey, you have bad browsing habits, your passwords are not strong, because we can see all of that. Why not use the browser as the opportunity to turn back to workers and say, here's a little test you got to take, and here's some videos you have to watch in education, but do it very much on an on-demand basis versus just a blanket thing, because we can take a little intelligence here now as a result of all of that. And I can't emphasize enough, if you look at all the logos at the bottom, it is any browser. Very recently somebody said to me, like, why DefensX? Why is this important? Why do secure browsers even matter? And if you think about on the left side, and I'm sure everybody's familiar with something called the kill chain. In that kill chain, you have 7 steps, right? Which is the recon, the weaponization, which means, then recon is typically an automated thing. And there's always sort of this perception of, cyber attacks where, there's some physical person sitting in a coffee shop someplace, hacking away with a black hoodie on, being a deviant. Typically, it's an automated process. Most cyber attacks are done automatically, and it generally is AI looking for things. It's looking for who my connections are. It's looking for who your connections are, and trying to figure out ways automatically, without really any human involvement, to figure out how to trick us. How to create phishing attacks that send us an email or send us a text that says, hey, just click here. I was talking to Ramya at SpikeIT. He told me to have a look at this. You should log in and do this. What's really happened is a very intelligent bot has figured out our connection and is using that against us. And what that really means is that the modern attacks have definitely become an automated thing. They weaponize themselves and they deliver. If you look at kind of that step 3, that is the part where there's something at the gate saying, click this, try this, do this, and that generally tends to be where the attacks happen. And that's that step 3, which is pre-attack. That's very much where DefensX lives. Traditional cybersecurity, which is incredibly important, Sentinel-1, which does, a very good EDR is a really good example, and a number of other tools, traditional antivirus, they all kind of live at step 4, which is post-attack, and that's that traditional cybersecurity side, which means essentially step 4 is bad things have already started, and the remediation tools have to do their thing because the attacks have already begun. And we tend to work very well as a complement to EDRs and that kind of thing because we are very much this pre-attack focus, which is, that step 3, sorry, which is delivery. And what's happened is, and why this kind of matters and why I'm bringing this up is because when you consider the vast number of attacks, they tend to be identity based, and things like phishing attacks and the stuff I just described. I mean, that's like 90% of the attacks. If you look from the last, we'll call it 3 years, something like 90% of all those attacks, and this is a Gartner number, are identity-based, meaning some kind of bot, program, hacking group, ransom group, that kind of thing, trying to steal data and trying to find their way in. And generally, the only reason for stealing data is because they want to do essentially a ransom attack. But they're doing it by trying to steal identities, stealing passwords, credentials, and all of that. I mean, there's tons of stuff that we do, but at a very base level, this has become a really big deal. And AI is absolutely amplifying the problem because now the attacks are moving much faster than humans can possibly move, and this has caused some major issues. So why DefensX? Well, if you look at the big famous attacks, like about a year and a half ago, MGM Resorts in the U.S. had a very famous attack. They had something like $100 million in losses. This is all social engineering, and like many of these high profile attacks that we've seen, MGM, in the US, we had Rite Aid, which is a big chain of drugstores. We just saw Ticketmaster last year get hit. Time and time again, these attacks are always identity based, meaning somebody's being tricked, somebody's pretending to be something that they're not. They're stealing passwords, they're stealing tokens, they're breaching MFA, unfortunately, and those attacks happen. Generally, once it gets past step 3 and step 4, all the bad stuff starts to happen. And the reasons for criminals to want to do this is not because they want to steal data anymore, but because they recognize somewhere along the line that people would pay a lot more money to get their data back. And ransomware is really more about a business than it is about a technology. Where DefensX lives in all this and why us, we are now that left of boom pre-attack measure that comes into play, and it's been quite successful. And really, this is all a result of that big shift to the cloud, where now browser-based threats are very real, and it has to do with the fact that most applications have moved to cloud versus things being loaded on a machine. And back in the good old days, if there is such a thing, people used to deploy servers in their back office and that kind of thing. We're seeing less and less of that, and we are seeing a massive migration to cloud. Now, that being said, enterprises, in many cases, the much larger ones, are still running key applications on site. Could very easily be things like medical applications and that kind of thing, government applications, but most of it's in the cloud. And there needs to be a secure layer to think about all of that. And what DefensX does is we like to think of it as a bunch of different steps, but it is a total stack that we have where we think about resiliency. It has to be simple to use. The compliance is a major thing because we're now able to report on what happens. And reputation management is a really big deal. And that's where we built our SKUs around, where there's something you may have seen, and we'll go to detail in a moment, but from things like AI and phishing attacks and credential protection to web data loss prevention, adding on top of that the ability now in different layers, depending on the license type, because it's a build, they all kind of work together, is true zero trust, replace the VPNs, and then human risk management. And a lot of this has come to play because now there's that shift from putting stuff on the OS into a computer, and that shift is now shifted to the cloud. What that also means is it's changed the way enterprises are looking at attacks. So what we've built here is a modernized approach to this. And this is a screenshot of a true zero trust environment where now what's happened is you've taken the regular normal web browser, cost effective. We've added DefensX as a license, and we now have a fast, cost-effective solution. And the idea now is that we're able to segregate things like work applications from personal use. We're able to put a perimeter around both. And ultimately what happens is if organizations maybe just need certain basic features, they're able to build to this for where they do need it. And the idea behind this is now we've created this secure work environment. So every time the worker clicks on something, there's this perimeter that's been built around it. And that 360-degree approach is a huge differentiator from DefensX to things that are previous on the market before secure or enterprise browser came along. But even more importantly, what I'm talking about here is it actually differentiates us from the other players that are out there, because we're not alone in the space of providing secure browsers. We know there are others, and we'll talk about some of that in a second. But what's really important to note here is that we are the only ones that really run the table from some basic protections all the way to something like this, where it's a true secured environment. The foundation of this comes back to what I talked about a second ago. And people, some of the folks here, because there are some familiar faces that I can see in the camera here that are using our DefensX. Many use it for just this, which is that foundation, which is essentially credential theft or data breach prevention, MFA breach, and that's core. And what core brings to the table is really the ability to stop 90% of those attacks I talked about. And core is that base SKU. And what's meaningful here is that if you think about core, this takes away a whole bunch of problems, right? Because typically what will happen is someone will get a little link, or they'll get a little prompt and say, click on this, do this. Well, first of all, we're blocking the ad so they can't accidentally hit those. But a new feature in core beyond our ability now to see bad URLs, potential phishing attacks based on all kinds of questionable things. Plus, we're already bundling inside there DNS protection, which is, DNS is still really important, but kind of an old idea. It's been like 10 years, well, more like 20 years since the idea of having DNS protection has been around. That being said, core encompasses all of that and adds on top of the ability now to spot things like MFA breach attempts and fake websites. And new websites are, and new attacks are getting incredibly sophisticated. For example, the vast majority of fake Microsoft attacks, where somebody is actually posing and pretending to be Microsoft just to get your customers' credentials so they themselves can very quickly do a session of their own and log into Microsoft. It's gotten to a point now where some of those websites are less than 5 minutes old. And we've developed something called fisheye as a result of that. What fisheye essentially is the ability, and this is all in core, to not just look at URLs and questionable things, but because we may not know what we're looking for, we're also looking for physical things. We're looking for visual things. And fisheye is very much AI. The whole idea behind it is if it's a fake Microsoft site, we're looking for things like colors, margins, pixels to see if it's right. And which of these is real on the right? They're both fake. And it's incredible how fast it happens. And we find the vast majority of these attacks are based on websites and URLs that are staged just minutes before the attempt. So somebody sees a little prompt and says, you need to relog into Microsoft here. They put their passwords in. Next thing they know, that organization has been breached. And those attackers automatically, and this all happens, not just like some guy sitting there looking at all this, it's all automated. It's already stuffed their passwords and credentials all around the internet, around the world within seconds. And we see, for those that may not know, core also includes dark web monitoring for passwords. And we're looking at encrypted hashes, and we're able to see how many times somebody's been pawned and somebody's taken a password and tried it around the internet. Well, that being said, that can happen in seconds because that's just how fast these things are automated. And it typically starts in a place like this. And with fisheye, we're able to spot, is that a fake Microsoft site? And a huge percentage of Microsoft or attacks, excuse me, as I mentioned earlier, are based on Microsoft. So of that 90%, like 90% of those tend to be Microsoft, where somebody has a fake site. It's the easiest one to trick people on because they automatically think, oh, I got to log back in, I'll just do this. So with fisheye, this is very much an invention of ours at DefensX. We're pretty excited about what the potential brings, and it just automatically comes with the package. So anybody that's already deployed it, it's already there. And for those that haven't tried it, certainly encourage everyone to test this out. Next up from there in our license type is web and AI data loss prevention. That's really what Core Plus is all about. So you think Core is being all about identity theft. Take those same features and add those to Core Plus. And in Core Plus, you add on top of that the ability now to keep data from going to the wrong places on the web. So in other words, users or workers cannot now put their files in the wrong places. If we spot it, it's a site that it shouldn't go to, or maybe there's some rules you want to put in place around, say, certain sites are not allowed, or we're now locking down and having a zero trust environment where only company-owned O365 or Gmail, that kind of thing, can be blocked in. and maybe the workers cannot go and they can't upload things to things like to the likes of, say, like a Dropbox or something like that. That's what Core Plus is all about. But beyond that, we're taking it a little further, because within data loss, where now hackers are trying to steal data or get their access to it, what we're seeing now are new problems with things like AI. And within AI, and this is within Core Plus, we're thinking in terms of commercial data protection, not just data protection against hackers, which is, of course, a huge deal. But now you put on top of that the ability now to keep people from doing things like taking screenshots of their QuickBooks online, because everything's moved online, or taking screenshots of their payrolling service or whatever else that happens to be online, which is pretty much every application. But you take it a little further, you consider now that a little gift to all of us from Microsoft is Copilot. And Copilot's an incredibly powerful tool. It gives me the ability as a business person to tell Copilot to help me make a PowerPoint slide, to help me do things like make Excel spreadsheets, that kind of thing. The problem is my company's private commercial data is at risk of winding up in Microsoft's training models. And what that means is everything DefensX does, now my competitors would have the ability, if I didn't have some means to keep private data from winding up in Copilot's Microsoft training models, they would say, "Hey, what's DefensX doing? How many new customers has Andrew delivered to this year?" Well, I certainly don't want anybody to know that. So with Core Plus, we've now added the ability to automate the blocking of commercial data loss. In other words, Copilot can no longer automatically take my commercial data and put it into the model. What probably everybody here probably doesn't know is that now the Copilot's on all of your clients' machines without some means just to keep that from automatically winding up the training model. Microsoft's already collecting data. Kind of like the good old days of Clippy, if anybody remember those days where you had this really annoying tool that kind of knew what you were doing. This takes it to the next level, because now it's this massive training model, this huge, large language model, which puts huge risk to any organization using Copilot. So back to what DefensX delivers here now is, again, commercial data protection against AI. And AI now can be used for the right reasons. And now we can also give you the ability now for your customers to tell their users without telling them. It's just going to be the way it is. You can only use company-owned O365 for all of your work. So in other words, there's no risk of it winding up in somebody's personal data, but at the same time, and locking it down as a SaaS protection. But now AI can no longer accidentally steal stuff. And it's not about theft. It's about them trying to learn more within the large language model. But that's not very healthy if there's private data there. There's a lot going on here. Taking this to the next level. And I did show you that stack where there's a bunch of different things that we do. Well, from Core Plus, now when we get into a higher end SKU, which is Premium, within Premium, we've always done things like private browsing. We'll call it RBI, remote browser isolation. And what that tends to mean, and it takes on different forms, but some of the original use cases for browser isolation are, and still very relevant in those organizations where they've got data loss prevention, and there's obviously lots of rules in place about what websites workers can click on and all that. There's always that manager who says, "Well, I'm a lot smarter than everybody else around here." So even though the workers over there, they've got their own, their own rules and regulations, I'm really smart. So I know better. I get to go to whatever website I want to go to because I'm the boss and I'm smarter than everybody else. So the idea for me is that, I just know better. So I can just click on whatever I want. It's no big deal. Well, that's generally where all the problems start. And typically what happens is that individual who thinks they're smarter than everybody else, and they probably are because they founded the company, tend to be running the highest risk of anybody there because anybody can get tricked. It's not about being smarter. It's a pretty sophisticated attacks. Unbeknownst to them, as long as they're running Premium from DefensX, they can click on whatever site they want. Unbeknownst to that worker, that person, they're automatically directed to our cloud. Within our cloud, it's an isolated browser session, and they're looking at pretty much anything they want in total safety because there's an air gap. And if you look at the 3 use cases here on my screen, on this slide, you have our cloud that sits between that organization's machine and the public web. So what that means is that browsing session, whatever it happens to be, whether it be a website that's totally questionable and risky, all the way through to things that are things we don't know about, it's happening in total safety. And all they're seeing is this live stream. And because we use Azure Cloud, We have points of presence everywhere, including Israel. And the idea behind this is now we have the ability to have a very short hop, which means that person that's surfing a web session that's actually happening in the cloud and not on their machine, it's a live stream. It looks and feels like a real web session. They're clicking around it. They're able to surf. They're able to do what they want to do, but they're doing it in total safety. So think law enforcement or legal firms where they have to go to websites where maybe you've got hate groups or or criminal organizations, that kind of thing. They can go look at that stuff and do their investigations in total safety, knowing that there's no risk of malware winding up on their machine because the browsing session is happening in our cloud, not in their machine. It's just a stream. But because we've now built that perimeter, we've now evolved into some bigger things. We're now able to turn the browser into a true zero trust client, which means we're now able to use that browser to replace things like VPNs, thin client. Because again, I mentioned this earlier in the presentation, we're now taking a much harder look at this. We're going on beyond just like SaaS protections you see at the bottom where we're locking down those applications, but we're now able to set up things like CASB replacement. So for the larger enterprise, why wouldn't we take that same everyday browser and make any worker that uses it completely secure and lock it down? So not only are we using browser isolation for things like virtual desktop interface, but we can use the browser as we go forward, and you're going to hear more and more about this, the everyday browser and turn that into that enterprise class browser, replacing traditional methods for VPNs. So much more efficient, much less expensive. And we now have the ability to extend organizations where they have maybe their own personal devices with subcontractors and workers that are outside of the circle of trust, we'll call it, not inside the network. But the idea is as long as they're running DefensX on their machine, anytime that they try to log into the organization and they're clicking on the browser and they're seeing the application there, what unbeknownst to them, what's really happened is we built a little secure tunnel there that sits outside of the traditional methods for things like VPNs. And there's no risk because now that user can no longer do things like accidentally put out their password someplace and that kind of thing because they're totally locked down. Plus now the ability to do true zero trust. That really takes everyday browsers, low-cost browsers, and it really turns them into a secured environment. And I mentioned earlier things like cyber resilience, which is a big deal. Within premium, you've always got, and I always say this about organizations, you've always got your usual suspects within companies where no matter how much training people are given, how many times they're told, look out for risks, don't click on, texts that say, look, just click here for the timeshare or put your password in here because Amazon's account has been compromised, that kind of thing, those kind of tricks. No matter what they do, they can't help themselves. The cyber resilience, which automatically comes with premium, is all about retraining those workers. In other words, you've got your risk score. So if you look at little dials and gauges on the left here, that's a real live screenshot from our backend. For those workers that are always at risk, what happens with DefensX is automatically, after so many times, we automatically see the workers that are putting terrible passwords in places or continually trying to click on stuff. Even though there's guardrails in place to keep them from making those mistakes, they just can't help themselves. And it's always the same thing. They get a training on a Thursday, they come back to work on Sunday, and it's as if the training never happened. They go right back to their old habits. Well, with cyber resilience and something we call autopilot, those workers are automatically noticed within our system. You don't have to do anything. There's nothing you have to actually do except set up all the rules. Maybe repeatedly they keep clicking on sites. Well, at some point, a little pop-up shows up and says, hey, you need to take a training about what sites are safe and when not to click on things. Or you need to take a training because your passwords seem to be weak. They must take the training to continue to work. Once they take a little test, and you can decide, of course, again, how well they do in the test. Do they have to get 60%, 70%, whatever it happens to be? The whole idea behind it now is you're now retraining workers based on their individual habits, not just a blanket training, hoping that everybody pays attention. And it really is targeted and changes things a little bit. And now what we've created is the ability to have a self-healing risk score where that risk score, where you see that little dial on the left, can continue to improve itself. Are we going to change people's behaviors? Probably not, but we'll definitely, at the very least, teach them you can't do these things at work with work machines. And if we are able to do that, that's a massive win. So a quick summary on all the license types to be very clear. We've done a bunch of different things, and I'll talk about how this compares and who the competition is, because I was asked to do some of that, which I think makes total sense. If you think in terms of legacy DNS only, there's still something called Classic. But that's if all it's important is just replacing legacy DNS with something that's kind of efficient, that's what we built that. But where it gets really interesting is core, where we take DNS, we include inside of that all the stuff I talked about with password and protection, credential protection, log, and of course there's data logs and all that good stuff. Take on top of that core and then add data loss prevention, which is a big deal on top of the password protection. That's core plus. One step up from there is premium. We're adding now a true environment that's locked down. We're able to do RBI, remote browser isolation, and of course the training. And really the whole idea behind this is you can mix and match depending on what your client's needs. In many cases, we see a lot of organizations where there's a deployment of a lot of core and core plus, and maybe a couple of folks are given premium within the organization, like the managers, where maybe they're higher risk and they need to have browser isolation. Other organizations, we're seeing premium across the board for a bunch of reasons, including things like browser isolation is just a big deal because there's so much risk going on, and the training aspect seems to pay for itself because one cyber attack can be a $5 million event. And we think in terms of what's the competition looks like and where does DefensX fit in all this. So I did throw some names in here. There are a lot of legacy installs of just DNS only. That's kind of everywhere, and there's a few vendors that do that. Some more famous ones of note, obviously Cisco Umbrella has a huge install base. On a regular basis, day over day, now DefensX is now replacing legacy DNS everywhere, like from large enterprises all the way down to two-person accounting firms. And reasons why, DNS just isn't enough. And really what we tend to be replacing DNS with is our core and core plus SKUs. And MSP partners of ours in every corner across the United States, Canada, Asia, Europe, it's happening everywhere because everyone recognizes that just DNS alone isn't enough. And some of the spend that was associated with things like Cisco Umbrella are now being applied to core and core plus, and the economics work. And what's interesting about this is now that also adds on top of it the middle category where there are some other secure browsers out there. We're not the only ones. A couple of familiar names there like LayerX or Perception Point, guys like that. What differentiates us from them is we're doing this in any browser, and because we are agent-based, it doesn't matter what browser the user launches, the rules are always in place. Our little extension always populates itself. It's really effortless. And it also encompasses on top of that this 360-degree protection that I talked about over and over again. This whole thing, I keep going back to this kind of thing where it's this complete package. It also encompasses DNS. And that's a huge differentiator for us. And if you think in terms of the higher end enterprise class browsers, when I say higher end, the guys that just focus on the really big customers like Talon or Island, two very well-known companies, and they do some really interesting things. The big differentiator between us and those guys, they are very much proprietary, which means it has to be their browser, it has to be loaded. You have to start changing habits. And all the other stuff I talked about, like DNS security and fisheye and all these things, that's so unique to us. So we are the only ones that really encompass the entire table of features from taking care of the old idea of point solutions all the way through to enterprise class and back again. And the real differentiator with us here is that it's simple to deploy. Once it's on the user's machine, it's easy to go up, scale up, move different license types around based on user needs, and configure things through templates. And the whole idea behind this is once you've set everything up, it's a lot less work for you as an MSP. And to me, that's a huge win. And can also run the table to your larger enterprises because for them, you now have a way to go back to them and say, hey, we can now replace some point solutions at the very high end, meaning virtual private networks, and of course, thin client. Quick word about us at the end here. Just a reminder for everyone, we're now distributed globally, as everyone knows. We have roughly 2,000 companies now using our product and counting. It's moving very quickly. We do have a diverse set of customers globally from fast manufacturing, healthcare, transportation, government. We have a lot of folks now in banking and finance. There's hedge funds using us. And we're now very quickly getting invited to the table to very large healthcare and very large organizations because the needs here are everywhere. Great example, there's a huge insurance company in the US that's now starting to deploy this because their goal is to get their call centers into a safe mode on a similar platform that they're going to give their executives for remote management. And there's a whole bunch of stuff we do there. And because it's a single platform, the whole idea is all the basic use cases can be there from the same deployment for the more advanced ones. So some quick takeaways here, because I know we're on time and we're watching the clock. It's one thing I can't say enough is that the browser specifically has become that, we'll call it communication vehicle or operating system for the business. And what that really means, the browser has become the super app. I mean, every time I launch my browser now, I have to do something, whether it be banking, emails, or checking my payroll. It's always the same thing. It always goes back to the browser. But by directly accessing the cloud and using the browser as a secure environment, we now have the ability to now attack the enterprise, replace some legacy point solutions like VPNs, not just DNS in the low end, but at the high end, replace really the way things have always been done. You know, and VPNs, frankly, have they been breached? There's a need to change things. And repeatedly now with CISOs that I talk to in companies of all sizes, they're now looking for alternatives. We've got that in place. And now by shifting the risk, this gives you now the ability to provide a 360-degree digital workspace for your client. And the whole idea here is less work for you, with really a new product and some better ideas. It can probably make you some good margins as well as MSPs. So that's my 30 minutes. Thank you all for your attention. I know it's a full day of watching video presentations. Hope we brought some new ideas to all of this. And our good friends at SpikeIT, of course, thank you to all of you to inviting us.